I read about everything that I could lay my hands on, and what most kids read in those days, any adventure stories. When I was very young, I loved fairy tales. And then I got into Robin Hood, King Arthur, things like that. Anything that was imaginative or realistic or romantic in the sense of adventurous, The Prisoner of Zenda, that type of thing. I used to tell myself little stories and I would draw them out, but I couldn't draw really. So what I would do, I'd take a sheet of paper and I'd draw a horizon line, just one line. That was the horizon, or that was the ground. And I would draw little stick figures and put them on the ground in different poses. But I never thought of things like the Hulk or Spider-Man or anything until years later when I started writing those. I started working when I was young. I took a few jobs when I was going to high school. When I was 14 or 15, I was an office boy. I was an usher. I had a temporary job. During World War II, I enlisted in the Army, but before I was supposed to be shipped over, they found out that I had been doing some writing at what was then Timely Comics, and they needed a screenwriter, and I spent my whole Army career writing training films and training manuals. I would take dull subjects and do them humorously and do little cartoons to make them more palatable to the troops and easier for the troops to get the idea. And I would like to think I won the war single-handedly because of that. Periods of war always would affect writers of anything that is contemporary. So during World War II, whenever we needed a major supervillain, we chose Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini. During the Korean situation or Vietnam, it was the communists. Whoever our troops were fighting, those were the villains. It made it easier for us to write the stories and also to make people relate to the stories. I never tried to preach because I began to realize we had a lot of fans. And by the fan mail that I received, I realized that a lot of the readers seemed to look at me as somebody who was an example to them. And I took that very seriously. But the one message that I thought was entirely proper for us to get across in our stories was that we all live on the same planet and we should really get along. All of us should get along. So we were the first company to feature a black superhero, an Indian superhero, and so forth. And I think I'm more proud of that than almost anything in our stories. I tried to make the stories somewhat believable. And that's difficult when you're dealing with fantasy, because basically our stories, superhero stories, are like grown-up fairy tales. How do you make it seem believable? If I just had a character who suddenly could transform from a normal human being into a green-skinned monster, how would I explain that? So it seemed to me the easiest way is to give it some sort of a scientific explanation. It occurred to me, if Bruce Banner, who was the scientist, stood somewhere where an explosion had occurred, and if the explosion was a case of the Army testing a gamma ray weapon. Now, in all honesty, I don't know what gamma rays are, but it sounds good. It sounds scientific. So I had our hero exposed to gamma rays. That turned him into the Hulk. With Spider-Man, again, I wanted something that at least seemed to have some validity. In those days when I wrote Spider-Man, radioactivity was the big thing. So I figured, okay, there's a spider who got in the way of some radioactive something, and the spider became radioactive. So I'll have him bite Peter Parker. He's bitten by a radioactive spider. Why wouldn't that give him a superpower? So I used that. And with Daredevil, our blind superhero, again with radioactivity, a barrel of radioactive liquid fell off a truck and shattered, and it hit him in the eye as a teenager. He went blind, but it developed his other senses to a high degree. I ran out of excuses after a while, and I said, I've got to make it easy for myself because there are only so many gamma rays and beta rays and radioactivity that I can think of. So I came up with the X-Men, and I said, if I just call them mutants, I won't have to explain how they got their power. We all know in science, in life, there are mutations. There are frogs that are born with 5 legs and so forth. So wow, I had the easy answer. So every X-Man was just a mutant, and I could give him whatever power I wanted. Although the idea of using the word mutant and mutations was quite scientific. So you can see I am nothing but not 100% accurate and scientific in everything I write. While I was writing comics, I tried to use a college-level vocabulary in the stories, or even higher. I would use whatever word was germane in the sentence. If I wanted to use a word like cataclysmic, anything, I felt I will use it, and I just felt our readers would either learn what the words meant by the use in the sentence, or if they had to go to a dictionary and look the word up, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Because I wanted to be able to write what I wanted to write and not be held back because, oh, well, the kids won't understand this. But little by little, we started getting mail from parents and from teachers. Some mother would write, "Dear Stan, little Johnny used to do so badly in English, and then he started reading comics, and the next thing I know, his grades in English are improving." And, I heard that from so many people and from so many teachers, and here is the theory that I evolved. Reading comics is one of the best ways to teach a youngster to read, because you can't really enjoy a comic unless you know what the words say, so you can follow the story. So they make themselves learn to read by reading the comic. And the more comics they read, the more of a facility they gain at reading comics. Now, nobody just stays with comics. Once you become a reader, then a whole world opens to you. Then you start reading everything. So while I'm not going to say comics are the greatest literature, I think they are a great tool to teach children how to read and to make them enjoy reading. The comic books today are not quite the same as they were when I was doing them. The artwork is different. It's much more illustrative. Most of the coloring is done by computer. Most of the colors are richer and heavier. And if you compare a comic book written today and drawn today with one from 30 years ago, let's say, or 20 years ago, you'd see there is a difference. But the actual format is the same. They're still stories that are told in pictures, with dialogue, with occasional captions, and they're fascinating to read. I don't think I'd create different characters now because the basics are the same. Spider-Man was a normal young man with normal problems. And he wasn't that popular with girls, so he had to worry about his social life, about getting a job, doing well in school. I tried to make him as realistic and empathetic as I possibly could. And then I gave him the one quality that made him colorful, the spider power. The characters that I'm doing today are really the same type. Characters that you could say, oh yeah, I know somebody like that, or hey, there's a little bit of me in that fella. And then you take one element which is unusual, which is colorful, which is intriguing, that makes the reader want to read more. But if those things happen to believable people, then the story is more interesting. I think that's what every writer tries to do, or should. A scientist, before he can create something, he has to have a vision in his mind. He has to know what he's going after. And I guess a writer has to do the same thing. Before you can write a story, you have to have a basic concept. You know what you want to tell. Then you've got to find the best way to tell it, just as a scientist, I imagine, has to find the best way to produce whatever or invent whatever he's trying to invent. When you think about it, everything involves science. The computers that we use, the video games that we play, the automobiles we drive, everything we do and use, our cell phones. To me, there is no more interesting subject in the world. And I, as a writer, of course, am grateful to scientists because you can't run out of ideas for stories. As long as those guys in their laboratories are creating so many new concepts and wonderful things, we writers should be eternally grateful.